Thanks for tuning in, everybody. We appreciate it. We're glad you're here. If you're looking at this screen, you're going to recognize those two faces because they've been here before. And if you've been to any of the national conferences, you've heard Craig and Jeff Morley speak. Now, just to put this into context, we've been speaking for about the last 20 minutes. And what we've gone through has been a master's class in a problem that faces appraisers every day. And we're looking at highest and best use. Now, I can hear you roll your eyes. Oh, haven't we done enough on highest and best use? And the answer is no, we haven't. And the reason we haven't is because highest and best use is not black and white. It's not cut and dried. It's not one and zero. It changes for every job that we do. Now, Jeff's going to start out talking about an assignment he just completed. And then Craig is going to finish up relative to some property that his family owns. Now, just so everybody knows, Craig at one time was on the state appraisal board and in Utah and chaired the board. Jeff is still on the Utah appraisal board and is its former chair. So we're talking to two appraisers who know what's going on. And they're not, this is not theory. This is not something they hope to be right. This is stuff that they are working on every day, and they're taking a look at this highest and best use problem from a standpoint of a state regulator. So as we listen to them talk today, put yourself in that room. You're watching the state decide what they're going to do about an appraiser who's been brought up before them because Fannie Mae didn't like their highest and best use, or the client didn't like the highest and best use, or somebody didn't like the highest and best use. So the appraiser has been turned into the state. Okay, Jeff, please go ahead with what you've got, and then talk to us about that from the standpoint of how you, as a state regulator, as a sitting state regulator, would look at the issue.
Yeah, that makes sense, Tim. Happy to jump in. Yeah, always great to visit with you, obviously. So I think there's two parts to that question. I'll lay out just briefly the scenario that I was confronted with specifically, but then try to parlay that I think into the answering that second part of your question as to when there is a question or a complaint filed at the state level alleging either an inadequate highest and best use analysis or a disagreement with what that conclusion was. What's the discussion? What's the thought process from a regulatory perspective that that we may look at? Now, just to be clear, this assignment that I was involved with has not been turned into the state yet. I may not put it past our friendly GSEs to take exception with my analysis, but at the end of the day, most of the time when you're doing a single family residential property, if it's in a subdivision on a single lot, there's not some clear change in what's happening in that subdivision, that area, the highest and best use is often going to be to continue to use it as a single family residence. What I was faced with was an assignment where it was one of those moments where you get this property that I'm thinking of it's in a very rural county, very large in terms of geography, very small in terms of population. In fact, I cited some of the population numbers in the report to kind of help paint this picture. I think that the total population in the county was somewhere on the order of 3,500 to 4,000 people. This particular community in which this property was located had a population of about 1,000 or so. No real population growth. So as I get into this assignment, initially I knew it was a home on some acreage. Was all that I knew. Get the assignment set up, start digging into it, start getting county information, which we have to call the county and ask them to send us their stuff. They don't even have the records posted online, which will give you kind of a sense of how rural we're talking here. Come to realize that this acreage actually consists of a whole bunch of independent building lots that were recorded, I think, back in the 1960s or something, in a subdivision that was never really improved. The subdivision plat shows roads that don't exist. There's no utility infrastructure. This home is actually on its own private well and septic. There's no municipal utility services to the property. But here I've got the situation where the property has a whole bunch of, what are recorded lots technically, but in practice, in reality, that they weren't. And so I knew as I got into it, oh crap, I probably didn't charge enough for this because I'm going to have to dive in and do more of a highest and best use analysis here to explain and determine, are these lots actual building lots? Do they have a separate highest and best use and fit under the definition of excess land? Or is this what it really appears to be on the ground when you look at it physically, really just surplus land where I've got buffer around me, but these lots, do they really have a separate highest and best use or not? Regardless of how they're recorded as far as the number of parcels that are there. So as I got looking into the legal aspects, I came to discover that this was actually in a zone that was called a redevelopment zone, which the county defined as addressing subdivisions exactly like this one that were recorded at one point, never improved, and that the county's trying to get back into an agricultural use out of a recorded subdivision use that was never improved or functional or operational. And so as I went through these pieces, I had to try to analyze and then come to an explanation as to what do we have? What are we dealing with? Some aspects of this property seem like that. Yeah, I've got a whole bunch of building lots that I could go sell and build houses on. But as I get looking at some of the physical characteristics, like I don't have improved road access, I don't have utility infrastructure. Nobody's buying these lots. If I just observe what's happening in the subdivision, nobody's buying these lots and building a bunch of homes on them. This county has, kind of a neutral growth rate. It's neither growing quickly nor is there a net out migration, but there's not really demand for a bunch of new housing units. So I think through the legal aspects, the physical, characteristics or limitations of the property, then into this financial feasibility analysis, what's happening and is there even demand for finished lots or not? At the end of the day, it took a while, but in going through this analysis, but I concluded, look, I think this is surplus land, and here's why. Here are the reasons that suggest that there's not really a market for these, as lots. One of which being, I can't even put a septic and a well on the same lot, and have proper distances and stuff because these were less than half-acre lots that were recorded at the time, I think. So it took some analysis, but I went through the process, and what initially looked like I've got a house with a whole bunch of independent building lots, turned out to be my conclusion was they're not, independent building lots. I've got surplus land, and the county is actually trying to get this back into an agricultural use. Interviewing the property owner, they told me that, yeah, the county's approached me about consolidating this into a single parcel, which is consistent with their stated purposes in their zoning that they have, in this subdivision at this point. And so it just caused me to have to dig in, a lot deeper to, think through what is this and how do I come to a conclusion that's credible. That's the main story there, I think, behind it, Tim. Quickly, I'll answer that second part of the question, and then we can listen to somebody else share some thoughts. But when we get a complaint, whether it's on something like this and usually there's some extenuating circumstance, there's something going on with the property that isn't cut and dry when there may be a difference of opinion as to what you have as far as the nature of the property. Do I have surplus land or excess land? From the state regulatory perspective, the conversations we've had as board members, say, hey, does the report and its analysis comply with USPAP? And part of that means, are there supported conclusions and analysis in the report or not? Where I see the biggest potential for problem is not addressing issues of that nature within the appraisal report and the highest and best use. If all I've done is checked a box and said, yes, the highest and best use of the property is for the current, as it's currently improved, and have not gone into an analysis and a discussion around those circumstances, that's a pretty clear cut, case to say there's an unsupported conclusion there. There's a lot more room to disagree potentially, with the analysis, but just like the appraisal board is not going to tell you got the value wrong, the number isn't right. They're going to determine, is it supported and is it credible or not based on the analysis within the appraisal report and within the work file. The same application is, in this situation of the highest and best use discrepancy or a question. If the appraisal report contains analysis that's credible and supported, there's room for difference of opinion, but you're not going to find yourself in a problem in terms of not having complied with USPAP in having a supported and a credible conclusion or opinion of the highest and best use. And really, that's where I see the biggest issue is it's oftentimes black and white. Either they've included the analysis or they haven't, and it's far less a situation of a detailed and nuanced discussion and then disagreement on the conclusions therein.
Okay, so let me make sure I understand. What you're saying is, okay, you checked the box. You said, for whatever reason, you said the present improvements are the highest and best use. But then you did more than check the box. You went through and you said, here's my opinion, and here are the 5 or 7 or 3 or whatever it is reasons that I developed in support of my highest and best use conclusion. Now, hold that thought, because you made an interesting point. You said the state board is not interested in the quality of your value opinion. The state board is interested in the quality and quantity of your analysis leading to your highest and best use conclusion. Do I understand that correctly?
Yeah, absolutely. And that comes from USPAP, which is what the state board uses as the measuring stick. Did the appraiser reconcile the quantity and quality of the data? And ultimately, that measuring stick is applied to the report and its analysis itself. But that's exactly right, Tim. And oftentimes when we find a deficiency, it's because there's no analysis, there's no quantity or quality of analysis. And that's not to say that all appraisers do that, but I'm talking about the problem child where there's a complaint and there's not the supporting analysis and documentation. And again, this is kind of from my perspective, the edge case. Most of the residential assignments that we get aren't this rural kind of anomaly that's out there, but these kinds of things manifest themselves in a number of different ways. And when you don't slow down and do the analysis when it's needed, you have to understand the highest and best use to understand what's even comparable to this property, who's buying and why. If I'm off base on who an actual buyer is for the property, how am I going to select appropriate comparable sales? How am I going to adjust and analyze them correctly? It just leads you down a path of ultimately an appraisal, a value opinion that's not supported, credible, and that's where it becomes a problem from the state. They're not going to say, you said 300,000 and it should be 200,000. They're going to say, you didn't support your conclusions of highest and best use, and now there's questions about comp selection and analysis and those sorts of things as a result. It kind of cascades.
Okay, so you're sitting there, you're on the board, you got your board member hat on, you're looking at the file, and you're saying, well, I don't have a clue about this guy's number because I don't live down in, what is it, Iron County or something like that?
Well, yeah, this one's in Garfield County, which is even bigger and more rural than Iron.
Okay, all right. So Garfield County that has more rattlesnakes than people. So I don't know anything about the number, but the appraiser has convinced me that the highest and best use conclusion in the report has support. I may not agree with it, but the appraiser has supported it. So it's the support, the analyses behind it, the interpretation of the analyses behind it, the support that the appraiser has for the highest and best conclusion that is going to persuade the board to say, okay, let's move on. There's nothing to see here. Is that right?
That's right. Yeah, absolutely.
All right, good. Okay, Jeff, stick close. All right, now, Craig, we're talking now. Jeff was doing that appraisal, so that's very personal to Jeff. Okay, now we're going to talk about a piece of property that the Morley family owns and has owned for some time, I'm assuming. And you're obviously you're going to give the details, so I don't want to give anything away. But again, this is not in downtown Manhattan. This is a property Well, okay, you give the details. Okay, so tell us what's going on here.
So my dad has always kind of fancied himself as doing some real estate developing, and kind of gotten in the mode where, gee, I think rural Missouri prices are cheap, and so we as a family have bought a farm and different houses scattered around northern Missouri, and one of these properties involved a big house that needed a little fixing up. But the thing that he liked the most about this property is that it was situated on 6 lots. Yeah, wow. I'm I found a bird nest on the ground. I mean, I've got a house with 6 building lots, and so from his perspective, this was just a great deal. Well, we've owned this now for a while, and we've not been had the time and ability to go in and make the repairs to the property to make it fully rentable or marketable. And so we've now, put this back on the market and are selling it for less than we paid for. And the new buyer is looking, and by the way, we're looking at all of $75,000 for this contract price we now have. So put it in context, this is a couple thousand square foot home on 6 lots that we've gratefully found a buyer that's willing to pay $75,000 for this property. So it gives you a sense. Now, to put a little bit of a economic context in this, it's in an area where the town in 2020 or in 2010 had a population of 125 people. It has now grown or otherwise declined or degraded to about 85 people. So we've seen about a 25% decline in the population of this community, and which automatically suggests there's not very much demand for housing in this area. It's a rural farming area in northern Missouri, which, by the way, northern Missouri is really, really cold. And so in the wintertime, and in the summertime, it's really hot and humid. And so that might explain why there's not quite as many people flocking to move there. But the reality is that these are all deeded individual lots. They have the ability to support individual building structures. But when the buyer came to buy the property, he insisted that he have all of the lots included with the house, because from his perspective, he wanted to own and control the land around him to provide that buffer area. So the question is, well, are these excess lots or are they surplus to the residential dwelling? And again, like Jeff's scenario, I think sometimes we look at the simple solutions to the problem. Well, they have an individual legal description. They have an independent individual highest and best use. They're excess land. And one of the things, Tim, that we haven't really talked about is why this becomes an issue in residential appraising, is that if I'm doing the appraisal for a GSE, Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, the VA, FHA, they all say, we really don't make loans on excess land. That their logic is, we make loans for residential housing. We're not land lenders. We're not commercial lenders. And so if somebody's trying to roll a bunch of subdivision lots into a loan that is not used or needed to support the residential dwelling, then they don't want to have that added value associated with the property included in this residential loan. And so Fannie and Freddie say, we will make loans if it's secured with surplus land, not excess land. And so frequently we will have people selling properties and they're lumping a bunch of building lots in with that as part of the sale. And so now the appraiser is tasked with determining, are these lots required to support the existing dwelling? and therefore surplus land, or are they independent and excess land and not to be included as part of the collateral for the loan? And that's where we kind of run into the problem. And in my analysis of this house that we are selling, it raises a couple of questions, but the question we're dealing with right now is this surplus land or excess land? And I think you could make a case for either scenario. But I think, and Jeff had alluded to this on his scenario, is that the problem that you have to consider is it financially feasible? Is there any demand for these independent parcels or not? And in many of these rural areas, you find that many of the buyers are buying properties in rural areas because they want to be on a large lot. They want to have that country rural setting, and plunking a nice house on a tiny lot in a rural setting sometimes adversely impacts the marketability of the property, which is the scenario that we are finding on this property there. And so my take on this particular situation is that these lots are surplus to the residential dwelling primarily because people won't buy the house if it's on a small lot, and there's no demand for these additional building sites that are potentially associated with this residential dwelling. And so my conclusion is that these are surplus to the house because there is absolutely no economic demand for these lots as independent building parcels. Similar, a little different than Jeff's scenario, but kind of a similar situation. I think the other situation, this property needs some repairs, and Jeff had kind of gone through and outlined in his discussion is who's going to buy it and what are they going to do with it? You know, and that is a critical part of the analysis that I don't think we really look at sometimes. But at some point, is my buyer an end user or is it a speculator developer? And in this particular case, it's an end user. But the question that I would pose to us as we consider this highest and best use analysis is if I have a house that in its current condition needs repairs in order to get a third party loan, like a Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, GSE loan, are the existing improvements consistent with the highest and best use? And we check that box that says, yes, the existing improvements are the highest and best use, but I have now conditioned my appraisal saying, well, you got to fix some stuff. So the question is, well, if I have to make repairs to a property to be able to get a loan, is the highest and best use the current use, or is the highest and best use to cure the curable obsolescence, and then it will be consistent with the highest and best use?
All right, let me complicate matters even further. And this question is to both of you. Okay, you've got your guy, he's willing to pay you the 75K. And you mentioned less than y'all paid for it, but he's willing to pay the 75K. And you said he's an end user. Now, you also said that the property as it sits, you couldn't move in there tomorrow. Unless you basically wanted to live under tarps or in a tent in the living room for a little while, but you couldn't move into it tomorrow. And you talked about speculators, and you talked about speculation from a standpoint of highest and best use. So here's my question. The guy has come to you, obviously he's done his research. He's not coming in blind. So he's well informed. You're well informed. But and there isn't much demand for real estate in Left Toenail, Missouri, or wherever it is you got this property. So he comes in and he goes, you know what? The Morleys live in Utah and they don't want to be out here. So I've got an opportunity to swoop in and get this property. And for 75,000 bucks, I can hold it for a few years and do nothing with it. And then maybe, put in some new drywall, some new carpets, some new cabinets in the kitchen, some new appliances. And then I can turn around and sell it. And I'll sell it with the lot that it sits on, and then I'll keep the surrounding lots and I'll sell those in the future. Now, here's my question. Is this guy paying you market value, or is this guy paying you investment value? And if he's paying you investment value, does that not tell you that the highest and best use of the property is to consider the extra ground as surplus rather than excess, despite their definitional differences?
Well, in my view, it's all about the economics. So if a guy's buying this place because he needs a place to live, he's going to fix it up and move into it, and it's going to be his house, and he has no intentions of doing something else, then as an end user, and we find people that are handy and they kind of go and say, hey, I can do this, maybe add a little value by, I can earn some quote developer profit by going in and developing, or builder profit by finishing the property. And then I've got something I can live in and it meets my personal needs. That's great. And I suspect that that's the situation in this particular case, but that we see all the time situations where people come in and say, I'm going to buy this, I'm going to fix it up, I'm going to sell it down the road, I'm going to keep these extra lots, and then I'm going to build other properties on them at some point and try to make a little money. And if we can do that, that's great. My use is a little different, but that's great. The issue that we run into in a place like this is I've got negative growth. In the community. So the chances of the population increasing are probably lower than the probability that the population will stabilize or decline. And as the population if the population stabilizes or continues to decline, the likelihood anybody's going to come in and want to buy and build a new place is not very good. And part of the problem that we run into in some of these places is that the labor costs are lower, no question about it, but material costs are the same. And the cost to go replicate any of these improvements is multiple times higher than the cost of buying an existing property and fixing it up. And so I think as we go through the analysis on some of these scenarios that we encounter, we have to look at the economic components to determine if is there a market. And just to kind of put into a little different, or a different twist on some of this, is that we've been looking for some properties to go do that very thing. Properties that we would like to buy, fix up, and sell. The thing that we're finding is that we're competing in many cases with end users. So some of the properties that we will encounter have a little deferred maintenance. There's a little bit of curable obsolescence. But because we're looking at it from the perspective of saying, if I buy this place, I'm going to go spend $30,000, $40,000, $50,000 fixing it up, and then I'm going to sell it. So I'm going to have some selling costs, I've got repair costs, and then I would like to not do it for free. And so I want to make some money. And frequently the problem we're encountering is that housing has gotten so high in our area that people are looking at it and saying, you know what? We're buying it as an end user. We can't find a place to live and that we can afford. And so homes that are kind of on the lower threshold of, the bottom end of a C4, maybe higher end of a C5 condition, something with some deferred maintenance, people are buying as end users and because the options for housing is just not there. And so I think the economic components that drive a market play a significant role that sometimes I don't know if I think if we're working in a market area, we have some intuition just from our practice in that area, but I'm not sure we do as good a job of describing the market conditions and what drives buyer behavior as perhaps we should, particularly when we encounter some of these properties where there's unusual situations taking place.
Your question,
Okay.
Tim, around is that market value versus investment value is interesting, because at the end of the day, if my buyer pool consists of investors, those two, values may converge on each other. But ultimately, what my dad's talking about is an investor has a target in mind, some sort of a return that they want to try to get. And so the way they think about pricing a property is different than the person who's looking to buy the home they're going to live in. And they're looking at what are my options to buy and live in something, whereas an investor is looking at it and saying, what price can I pay given what I'm going to have to spend on this property, and given my target return rate on this property, what price can I pay, and have that all pencil out and make sense for my investment analysis. And so sometimes those will converge, sometimes they won't. When you're competing with a bunch of end users, it's not always the case, but oftentimes the end user will pay more than the investor if the investor has a target return that they're trying to achieve. And so that's why this highest and best use is so important, is to understand who's the buyer pool, and how are they thinking about pricing these properties. If you're not clear on that, it's easy to go astray, in the analysis beyond that.
That's why I asked the question. Okay, it closes at $75,000. I don't know if Missouri is a full disclosure state, but assuming an appraiser pulls the deed, $75,000, okay, and uses it as a comparable sale. But yet, given the scenario we were just working with, was that investment value or market value? We know the sales price, $75,000. But if it's not the market value of the property, then you can't use it as a comp. Whereas if it is, you can. Now, the issue is that you mentioned convergence. The two numbers may converge. Okay. But whether they converge or not is irrelevant, in the sense that investment value, by definition, is not market value, which is therefore not investment value. That may be the same number, but then the appraiser has to sort that issue out. Now, let me follow up, Owen. If we hear thunder, it's just started to rain again, and there's sorry about Florida in the summer. Hello. Okay, now okay, you're up before the board, wherever the board meets, you're sitting there, you got your board hats on. And I mean BOARD, not BORED. You got your board hats on. And there's that issue. So it's $75,000, but you're looking at, okay, what did the appraiser do to convince me that the 75K is market value? In other words, retail value, rather than wholesale value, investment value, because the guy, whatever your guy's name is, has to buy it. He's paying $75,000. He's parting with 75K. That's not a problem. But then he's got to part with another 50 or 60 or whatever to fix it up. And then, as your dad says, he doesn't want to do it for free. So, and you're looking at this, and it's $75,000, says right there, copy of the deed, $75,000. What is the board going to do from the standpoint of saying, well, okay, the appraiser got it wrong because that's really investment value? Or, yeah, appraiser's right, that's not a problem, that's market value. How is the board going to separate those two issues, if indeed the board is even going to?
From what I've seen, I rarely is the board looking at it from that angle, or maybe even that nuanced of an approach. Ultimately, they're going to say, did the appraiser develop the assignment, and did they report the assignment? in a credible and in a supported way. Now, in this scenario, if there's marketing around this property that says, "Hey, this is a handyman special," or "This is calling all investors. This thing needs TLC." I mean, there are a lot of things that can that I think should be a tip off to an appraiser that, hey, this might be marketed as something other than a market value type of a property. But ultimately, if the appraiser has reported and analyzed the listing, the pending sales, and the prior sell history of the property they're appraising, I think they're going to be just fine. What I see is that sometimes they'll say, "Yeah, this property listed for 75,000, or it sold for 75,000." Period. End of sentence. And there's no analysis as to was that an arm's length transaction? Was it reflective of the market or not? Obviously, in developing that, you're going to be looking at other properties in the market and around to see how they're priced and how they compare. You got to do that analysis in a credible way. But all of it at the end of the day is to tell the story of the value of this property is X and here's why. And part of that is reconciling the fact of the price that's being paid for the property with the opinion of value. They may be the same, they may not, but there needs to be the analysis and the reconciliation. And as long as that's there in a credible way, you're fine from the board's perspective. But where I see it be a problem is that it's not there. It's just reported sold for X or is under contract for X. Here's my value, and there's no analysis or reconciliation of the two.
Okay.
And Tim, I think maybe to go with that is that there are certainly situations, and there's lots of, I get calls frequently from investors who are saying, "Hey, you have a fixer-upper. I'm looking for fixer-uppers." And we will see in a lot of these market areas where investors are out trying to buy these things from property owners where someone dies, there's an estate issue or other things where the property was never exposed to the market. And they're trying to buy these things at a price that will allow them to make the repairs and make a profit on their efforts. And so I think from a practical standpoint, the thing that Jeff is pointing out is that the price is a fact. I mean, they paid X number of dollars for the property. The part that requires the analysis is how was that price determined, or how was it developed? Was it exposed to the market? Is the market for these things different than the price that was paid, or is that just we establish the characteristics of a market, and I think it's too easy to just report what we the price, the facts, without doing the analysis that says this is why I believe this is a market sale or an investment transaction or whatever we conclude. But if all we do are state the facts, we have fallen short of our obligations to analyze and report the conclusions.
Okay, one more question. And okay, you're on the board and you've got the file open in front of you, and the appraiser has checked the highest and best use box, and that's it. Now, you're sitting there in judgment. I mean, you're holding this guy's fate in your hands, this appraiser's fate in your hands. And you say, well, okay, why didn't you just check the box? Why didn't you give us a decent highest and best use analysis? And the guy, trying his best not to take an attitude, says, wait a minute, it's a 35-year-old house. Every other house in the neighborhood is between 25 and 50 years old. It's zoned residential, and the city folks told me that the zoning is not going to change. There are no more vacant lots in the neighborhood. People are not buying houses in there and then either tearing them down and redeveloping the lot, or they're not buying houses in there and moving walls and going all Property Brothers on them. They move in, they put in new carpet, a little paint. Okay, it's just your basic house. And then it's sold from one retail seller to a retail buyer. I mean, that's obvious. And because it's obvious, why do I have to tell you what's obvious? You should be able to look at the photographs. You should be able to look at the maps and determine that. So why do I have to go through all this silliness to tell you what you either know or should already know? Now, it the appraiser would be stupid to take that kind of an attitude, but we're looking more at the argument than the attitude here. So you're saying, yeah, I'm familiar with the neighborhood. I got friends who live in the neighborhood. So what do you do to this appraiser? What happens?
Well, from my perspective, as you lay out that particular scenario, Tim, it depends on how much of an impact it has on the credibility and the conclusions of the report. In the scenario you laid out, summarizing your analysis is a standard 2 reporting requirement under USPAP in an appraisal report, and they didn't do that. My personal feeling would be summarize what you just told us, put that in your report, and you're fine. I mean, that's what needs to happen, going forward. If the conclusion of highest and best use was errant, or there's the potential that it maybe was for something different in one of the other scenarios that you laid out. There's a whole bunch of redevelopment in the neighborhood, or there's alternative uses taking place, and the appraiser failed to disclose, analyze, and report on that. It's probably a bigger issue and probably higher stakes. One of the things that at least our board will consider, I think, and hope that most do, is is this a first time offense? Is this the only thing that is a problem or a concern in the appraisal report? Are there compounding problems in the report or not? Has this appraiser been given opportunities to fix things and have has just chosen not to or not? If it's a first time and this is the only complaint or the only issue in the report, they usually receive the message pretty loud and clear. USPAP says, I got to summarize my conclusions. You need to just summarize what you just stated that should be obvious, and that doesn't have to take 4 paragraphs to do it. Usually a warning or possibly some education. If there are further deficiencies, or if there's multiple times that the appraiser has been brought up with issues that they're neglecting or failing to address, then the punishment or the results may be more severe at that point. But that's the way I would go about thinking about it. At least those are the factors I'd take into consideration.
Okay. All right, Jeff, thank you. Craig, what is your
Well, yeah, I think where you run into problems is that when the property is where highest and best use becomes a bigger issue. I'm on a large lot, and the lot's large enough under the current zoning to be split. And I have clicked the box, but I haven't provided my summarized conclusions of is it surplus or excess land. And years ago, I found a lot that had been foreclosed on in that by the bank, and they put it up for sale, and it was a pretty decent price. Curb, gutter, sidewalk was in place, power, water, sewer, everything's there. And I think, sweet, I think I can buy this and build a house on it and try to make a little money. Well, I go to get a building permit and discover that it was an illegal subdivision. And so I had to then go get the engineering done to go get this as a recorded subdivision, a 1-lot subdivision, and I had to go put in an electrical transformer to comply with the utility requirements for the lot. I think one of the problems we run into is simply because you have a deeded lot doesn't always mean that it's a buildable lot, or that it's not going to require some additional effort to get it done. And so we will routinely see situations where you've got a residential property in a half-acre zone, but the lot is large enough to support an additional dwelling, except that I've now got to determine, is there enough frontage? Is the utility infrastructure enough there? Is it economically viable to do it? And so I think sometimes the analysis is nuanced. Number one, it requires a little bit of checking to see what it is you've got. And at the end of the day, Just because you're in a half-acre zone and you've got a 1+ acre lot doesn't necessarily mean I've got excess land. And understanding the requirements that would to turn this into excess land become an issue that as appraisers we just need to think about. It becomes a little more complicated when we're in a situation where you've got a house that has 2 lots, and then you have to start determining, well, is that second lot required to support the existing residential building improvements? You know, we've had several situations where you've got a house that is built and it encroaches onto the second lot, or you've got the swimming pool and the garage on the second lot. And at some point, it requires some analysis to determine, is this excess or surplus land? What do I do and how do I do it? And I think the message that Jeff is suggesting is that there's not always a clear-cut answer, but providing the analysis and support in why you concluded what you did is important. And if you conclude that it's surplus land and you've put a meaningful analysis to support it, I don't think you're going to have, it would be a rare circumstance that you might have challenges or issues with your board if you've gone through the analysis part of it to explain your reasonings and conclusions.
So basically what it all comes down to is 2 words: support it.
Yeah.
All right, Jeff, if someone wants to get in touch with you, what is your email address?
You bet. Probably the best way to get a hold of me, J Morley, Morley at Accurity, ACCURITY.com. That's probably the easiest way, Tim.
Okay. So J Morley at J initial, J Morley, not J-A-Y, J Morley at Accurity.com. Okay, good. Thank you. Craig, what about you?
Call Jeff.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, that's the problem. Craig wants to go ride horses. Yeah, okay. Well, I mean,
No.
My forward button works really well. I know how to get it done.
Yeah, no, I've got a couple of email addresses. Probably the easiest one to remember is valuepro@gmail.com. Value doesn't have an E, so it's VALUPRO@gmail.com.
and your high school English teachers told you about that, but okay, we're just going to ignore that.
Yeah, well, the other problem is go try to find a cool Google address, and it's already taken. So you get what's left over.
What did the Stones say? You can't always get what you want, but sometimes you get what. Okay.
Sometimes is the operative word there.
All right, gentlemen, thank you. I appreciate it. I appreciate your time, appreciate your expertise, and I'm sure all our viewers will too. So everyone, thank you for being here with us. We appreciate it. We'll see you next time. Thanks. Bye-bye, everybody.